Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Thomas Frank, a longtime environmental activist in the Indiana area, East Chicago particularly, which a couple years ago I went down there because there was another lead crisis that was pretty much swept under the rug. We'll revisit that in a little bit. But it seems over the weekend there was, we are not positive, but a leak or something at the massive BP refinery in Whiting, Indiana, that as far as I could tell, BP has not said anything about, which is suspicious to me. But a lot of residents in the nearby area, and we're talking all over Indiana, as well as folks in Michigan and other states, have experienced a horrible smell out of that refinery and health symptoms. So, as my go-to toxic tour person, you gave toxic tours around that BP refinery. Tell us, when did this smell start? What is the smell from? And folks you're talking to, what have been some of the symptoms?
Well, this started on Sunday morning. They had a malfunction in the facility. Apparently, there was a fire. And that's what we know at this point. There have been lots of different articles, saying one thing or another. At first, BP initially blamed the weather as causing some problems. We really haven't had much extreme weather. We've been pretty much dry for the last month, but we've had a few rainstorms, not that terrible, not large winds at all that we're commonly used to here. So they've had some sort of malfunction. It triggered a problem. One of the ways in which BP oil refineries deal with malfunctions is they have to exhaust out very quickly, either up the stacks or out into Lake Michigan, into the water discharge. So they chose to shoot it off the stacks. And
in English, what does that mean for people that don't know? What are the stacks? And
yeah, that's the big flares that you see at
Okay.
oil refineries. Whenever you see a flame there, that's telling you there's basically been a malfunction. But they had a massive malfunction apparently with a fire in the facility. And so with that, there was a massive release all day, multiple malfunctions. I think they tried to pace it, of hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. Now, hydrogen sulfide is a byproduct of the tar sands up in Canada. And if you know, lots of people have been organizing against pipelines and oil refineries and refining that because it's the dirtiest fuel out there. So it's high in sulfur as well. They call it heavy sweet crude, or heavy crude, because of the sulfur content.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to show a picture. This was, I guess, Sunday afternoon.
Right. That's a view outside my window.
Okay, so you see the smog and everything over the oil refinery. So, okay, tell us what was the smell like and what were symptoms people were experiencing?
Well, sulfur smells like rotten eggs, and so this is a massive discharge. So if you're here at ground zero, like Marktown is directly across the street, that is just overwhelming for a lot of people. Nobody is supposed to be smelling that. So this sulfur plumes were being released off the stacks, and they were floating 60, 70 miles away to the east, over 3 counties and into Michigan. So people were smelling it all over the region. They were making complaints to their local officials there. They were trying to contact NIPSCO, thinking it was a gas release in their municipality or something like that, or somewhere in their facility. Eventually, individuals were able to track it down all the way to the BP refinery here in East Chicago. So that's really what took place on Sunday. I think by early afternoon, they were able to pinpoint it on BP.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to read, I mean, I spoke with 3 people yesterday that live in the area. I was told respiratory distress. People are experiencing trouble breathing, felt like a rash in the lungs, throat and cough, a lot of sudden mucus. Some people had nausea. Some people had terrible chemical taste in the mouth. Somebody told me they were up all night after it happened with inflammation and breathing, coughing. Multiple friends talking about chemical taste in the mouth. One person who does have immune issues, Lyme disease, it just
Right.
activated everything. So even just a few hours of this wreaks havoc. Now, can you tell me, I'm sure BP sent out an alert right away telling
No.
folks to stay inside, specifics of what was going on?
So you got to remember, the industries like BP or big steel and big oil, they operate on a privileged premise. It's the burden is on the public to bring the issue to them. They never discharge. They self-regulate. EPA provides authorities to IDEM, which allows these big industries to self-regulate. They don't alert anybody unless somebody alerts them of a problem. And so that's the situation here. And it was large enough. And if you remember, Indiana, we're pretty friendly to the oil industry. Pence himself, the past governor and vice president of the U.S., was an oil man himself here in Indiana, and had $8 million of fines that were wiped out and hidden for a long time. And they ended up going bankrupt.
I couldn't believe it the first time I drove over that bridge from Chicago, Illinois, into Indiana. All you see is just smoke upon smoke upon smoke coming out of factories and this and that. And then I looked into it, and I mean, there's not really many regulations in the state of Indiana.
No, we're pretty relaxed. And that's the reason why a lot of the heavy industry has left Chicago in the 1980s and has been reindustrializing the southern shores of Lake Michigan. I consider us here in southern shores of Lake Michigan, here in Indiana, as a industrial colony of Chicago. And they were able to push all the no good, dirty stuff into the neighboring political area. And they are able to rewrite their laws. They're a much more progressive state than Indiana. And they are able to fight against a lot of issues like this. They're building up a great coalition of groups on the southeast side of Chicago around climate justice and environmental justice. We're here in Indiana. That is a hard fight. There is no laws backing up environmental justice or anything here. So.
And can you talk about with BP here, isn't there some type of process where, the county or the city or somebody, we know BP seemed to want to hide it, that they would send out an alert, stay in your home, here's what's been released? I mean, the messages I saw, let me just read some of them. We're blacking out names. This is from a Facebook message. It was terrible in New Buffalo. My daughter was complaining later in the evening from nausea. She wasn't feeling well earlier in the day, so I just thought it was that. We have followers on another page in Michigan telling us they are sick too. New Buffalo employees were getting sick in the parking lot as recently as 8 a.m. My whole family has headaches, vomiting, and we've been needing a nebulizer and inhaler. This is crazy. I heard it was a gas leak at U.S. Steel. They are burning it off. Emergency personnel are there. Sulfur dioxide affects the respiratory system, particularly lung function. Thank you for the information. With all due respect, if they do not yet know the source of the odor, how can anyone say there is no threat? This is all residents talking on Facebook. So obviously they're not getting a clear message from the city, county, obviously BP, what's going on.
Right. IDEM, about 7 years ago, IDEM moved out in Indiana Department of Environmental Management.
Okay.
Indiana Department of Environmental Management moved out of the region. Now, this is a real major issue because the region here, Northwest Indiana, is perhaps the most industrial region on the planet, outside of maybe some places in Ukraine that are being destroyed right now, in Russia. But this is one of the most industrial regions on the planet right here. We have the largest tar sands refinery in East Chicago right here with BP. We also have the largest integrated steel mill in the Western Hemisphere right here in East Chicago. And then we have a plethora of chemical companies and secondary companies that feed into those two industries. With environmental justice issues like East Chicago and Gary, we tend to attract the dirtiest, no good industries out there where they can't find anywhere else to go. We sit at the bottom of the economic food chain, and it's hard to fight some of the wealthiest industries in human history, especially when the public process is organized against you. The whole, forgive me about the EPA and what they're supposed to do, but they only regulate like 8 chemicals. A lot of these things fall outside the process. And then when industries like BP write a permit, they can scratch it out. They can hire an intern, scratch it out on a napkin and hand that in as if that's their permit. The burden that is placed on the public thereupon to find what's missing in that permit and what they were doing. When BP originally wrote the permit, I think there was like 4 or 5 flares that they didn't account for in the permit that they built, that they were discharging from, but were never in the permit. So we have a long history since they built this refinery. The largest private investment in Indiana's history was rebuilt in 2014 and went online in 2014, and immediately had many malfunctions, discharges into Lake Michigan, discharges into the air that were causing lots of havoc and continue to do that. So they were fined in 2012, $8 million, and forced to do $400 million of environmental procedures or put on controls. There has been a stack of mismanagement mistakes thereupon. And again, just recently, they were fined another $40 million. I think it was back in May of this year for other discharges. The BP refinery.
I mean, not to interrupt, but fined.
Yes.
Is there ever any criminal consequences to poisoning the people, Mother Earth? I mean, we just saw the NTSB hearing in over East Palestine, where the manufacturer of the chemicals that they detonated, the cancerous chemicals, basically said, we repeatedly told Norfolk Southern they didn't have to do this. I'm not hearing anything about criminal consequences for nuking a town in Ohio. And here, I mean, yes, that's a lot of money, 40 million, et cetera. But in the grand scheme of things, this is just part of doing business for BP.
They make more than $30 billion a quarter out of this one facility. So, what's $40 million? It's the cost of doing business on a small scale. There are lots of issues like that. We have a problem where, how do I say, as a economic hegemon here, they are the ones that control economic development in Northwest Indiana. So you're not going to find a politician or a regulatory agency, which we don't have one in Indiana, looking to oppose them. We often have to go to outside sources. And we also have to, the fact that this discharge resulted in people in Michigan suffering consequences, or in Chicago, which is very close to us, but unfortunately the winds weren't blowing in that direction. Those are the political entities that would come against it and try to stop it. There is very little political courage here in Northwest Indiana to go up against the region hegemon, the entity that writes all the plans, that distributes the funds. They fund the arts. They even fund the regions. We have the Save the Dunes. They fund the learning center of the Save the Dunes. They place in little parks or green spaces in many of the schools in the region and stuff like that. They like to play like they're a good entity, but they're unfortunately a no good, dirty industry. The irony.
I'd like to ask you, because I see this in Flint and Kalamazoo, where there's a paper mill poisoning people with the same toxic gas that was just released by you. But isn't this in large part an effect of sending all our jobs to other countries? So you have all these counties, cities, local municipalities. These are some of the biggest employers in town. So there's kind of a gotta let them do whatever they want, because we don't want to really go at them and lose more jobs to other countries.
So they hold the jobs. There are not many jobs any longer in these facilities because they automate many of the processes. We're known as a steel town. I'll give you a good example of how this plays out in jobs equation. In the 1970s, we employed over 70,000 people in steel and steel-related jobs. Today, we employ less than 1,800. And since then, we have increased in production every single year since, except for 2008, where we had an economic downturn. So we're more productive with far, far less people. So we've suffered during the neoliberal era, massive unemployment here. And so when there is an offering of a job or a company coming in, Northwest Indiana tends to jump on it and say yes to anything. It doesn't matter what they are, where they are. We end up being the dumping grounds of Chicago. Cook County in Chicago has a 25-year moratorium on landfills. Well, where do they end up sending a lot of their garbage? Well, they go to Gary. They find facilities in Gary, and they create these green projects called waste to energy projects, which are noxious, dangerous facilities. We have
and also should have mentioned up top, most of these communities that they're dumping refineries and all these plants are predominantly, lower income, poor, Black, brown. Yes, there's poor white people being affected, but predominantly in these areas, it's poor Black and brown people.
Yes, it's the most disenfranchised where a lot of these projects get passed down to those who are on the bottom of the economic food chain.
And lastly, getting back to this recent whatever fire leak, we don't know because BP seems to hide it. You're not a doctor, but what do you say to residents who are worried? Because even though the smell's gone, people are having health symptoms. I mean, what do people do in this situation where you're not getting transparency from the company? The county, city seems to be sending out mixed signals.
Well, I would organize against it right now. As I said earlier, that IDEM, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, is hosting tonight in, I think it is Griffith or Lake Station, a public hearing on designating Northwest Indiana a non-attainment zone, which I think I described earlier. They had previously abolished the non-attainment zone so they can build this brand new refinery.
And explain that. What is a non-attainment zone?
So one of the things is we discharge industrial releases into the atmosphere. Generally, Lake County, Indiana, there are 3,143 counties in the U.S. Lake County, Indiana generally ranks in the top 5 to 10 in terms of industrial releases into the atmosphere. And it's all attributed entirely to the industries that are in East Chicago and Gary. BP, Cleveland Cliffs, and U.S. Steel. And previously, what those 3 companies were pumping out was too much for the atmosphere, the carrying capacity of the atmosphere, and people were getting very ill. We saw days like this constantly, like what we're seeing today with the smoke coverage. And so it was designated a non-attainment zone, so that when it comes to permitting, it would have an effect on what type of projects would occur here. Prior to the BP announcing its project, the government actually pulled IDEM out of the region, and they redesignated the region an attainment zone so that it can include a major project like BP. And then the retooling of the steel mills, that would give them in their economic, in their permits, breathing room to make mistakes like they're doing today. We don't suffer from a lot of malfunctions. We suffer from living under the plume of permitting. They are allowed to do a lot of things here that they aren't allowed to do anywhere else. That's why they're located here and in other sacrifice communities. So right now we're looking at a chance to redesignate the area.
Thank you, sir, for giving us the deep dive, and we'll stay in touch on this.
Thank you so much, sir.